The temperature had already passed 100 by the time I turned off the county road and started down the gravel path. That stretch hadn't been maintained in years, just ruts and limestone dust that turned the edges of the corn white. The fields looked dry enough to burn. Grass curled around rusted fence posts, and every porch had a bug zapper crackling in the heat. The work was routine, checking pressure gauges, monitoring wells, the usual for this stretch of flat land east of Tamora. The fields rolled out under a sky so wide it swallowed sound. Center pivots traced slow circles over dry dirt, dust devils spun in the distance, and the older co-ops here had seen better days. The co-op had set me up in a double wide on the edge of one of the southern plots. No curtains, no air conditioning, just an old fan in the window and a fridge stocked with bottled water and ham slices. I didn't complain. I'd stayed in worse. It was quiet. That mattered. I parked beside the unit, unloaded my toolkit, and took a walk around the edge of the property before the real work started. I always do that. Walk the fence line, check the condition of the pump access, and get a feel for the terrain. That's when I saw it, standing out there past the drainage ditch, just beyond the equipment shed. A scarecrow. Old-fashioned, with a sun-faded flannel shirt, arms stretched wide across a timber post. Its face was a stitched burlap sack, puckered like it had been stuffed too tight. And where the mouth should have been, someone had threaded rusted wire through the canvas. The hands weren't gloves or straw, they looked like dried bundles of roots, twisted and black. One of them clutched a tangle of corn silk bound in twine. I hadn't noticed it in the spring. Maybe it was new. Or maybe it had always been there, and the corn just hadn't grown tall enough to see it. Either way, something about it left a pressure in my chest. Not fear. Not even discomfort. Just a pause. I don't know how else to describe it. The first day passed without much to say. I checked the northern pressure lines, adjusted one of the pivot tracks, and logged a slight drop in soil moisture along the west edge, probably a calibration issue. I kept the radio on in the shed while I filled out the paperwork. Local weather, crop reports, a fire watch warning for parts of Kansas. Then, just before I turned it off, one of the AM stations played a recording from a community potluck out in Friend. You could hear kids laughing and singing something in the background, some kind of rhyme. I didn't catch all the words, but the last few lines stood out enough to make me stop writing. First the crows, then the hush / then the man with hands like brush. / if you speak, he hears you breathe / if you run, you'll never leave. I remember those words exactly. It wasn't just the way the kids sang it. It was how the adults didn't laugh. That night, I went to shut the shed door and noticed something on the steps of the double wide. A bundle of corn silk, tied with black twine. Same as the one in the scarecrow's hand. It hadn't been there earlier. I looked out at the field. Nothing moved. The wind had died sometime after sundown. Even the bugs had gone quiet. Inside, the lights buzzed faintly. I made a sandwich, washed up, and sat at the little fold-out desk by the front window. The trailer didn't have much, just a mattress, a folding chair, and a few cabinets stocked with paperwork from whoever used it last. I opened one drawer and found a pocket knife, a cracked Polaroid of someone gutting a catfish, and a folded map of the county with several fields outlined in red. Then I saw the desk. Scratched into the plastic surface, right where my elbow rested, were the same words I'd heard on the radio. If you speak, he hears you breathe. If you run, you'll never leave. They weren't new. The grooves were worn down smooth, probably carved months ago. Maybe years. The rest of the night, I left the radio off. And I didn't touch the corn silk bundle. I just swept it gently off the step and let it fall into the grass. That night I left the lights off, even when the sky turned orange and the wind stopped blowing altogether. I sat near the back window and listened to the corn. At first it was nothing, just a rustle, just the whisper of dry leaves brushing against one another in the breeze. But it didn't stop. And it didn't move. It stayed in one patch, too close to the house. There was a sound like footsteps, nothing heavy, nothing sharp, just the steady press of something shifting through dry dirt and brittle stalks without weight. They moved slow, dragging in places. And then they stopped right behind the screen door. I didn't move. The fan in the window clicked once, then twice, then slowed down and whined. Something scraped gently across the mesh screen, too stiff for a fingertip, too smooth for a twig. Something that felt like dried stalk or twisted root. I didn't look. I didn't speak. And just before it left, I could hear breathing. It came slow and steady, not close enough to feel, but not far enough to forget. In the morning, there were marks in the dirt by the door. The scarecrow in the field stood where it always had, only now, one arm was raised. Not all the way. Just bent slightly at the elbow. Enough to notice. Enough to mean something. By morning, the sky had gone yellow-white and the wind picked up just enough to stir the dust in little circles by the truck tires. I spent most of the early day checking lines along the southern boundary, standard readings, all within tolerance. I tried not to glance out toward the scarecrow when I passed the shed, but the raised arm lingered in my mind like a half-finished thought. I hadn't imagined it. That part mattered. Nothing else had changed, at least not at first. Same split fence rail. Same curl of brown grass climbing the ditch edge. But I started noticing other things by noon. Barbed wire near the north gate had been twisted into tight spirals, not knotted, not broken, just curled in perfect loops, like someone had bent it with heat and pliers. That wasn't weather. That wasn't age. The fence line was older than me, but it didn't twist like that by accident. I wrote it down in my log and moved on. That's what you do out here. You keep working. The second thing I found was stranger. One of the western corner posts had snapped at the base, not splintered or cracked, but sheared clean through. The top half lay several feet away, dragged into the stalks, and the base looked crushed, not from above, but from the sides, like something had squeezed it until it gave way. I stood there a while, just looking at the impression in the soil around it. Something had moved through. Big, heavy, and quiet. By the time I circled back, the sun was at its highest. Heat shimmered off the tin roof of the shed, and the scarecrow looked like it hadn't moved at all. But there was something new tied to its wrist. I didn't notice it until I came closer, a bundle of corn silk, dark and dry, bound with black twine. Just like the one I'd swept off the step. I didn't go closer. I backed away and finished my checklist for the day without crossing into the northern field again. That evening, the news came over the radio. Local segment out of Seward, short, quiet, without dramatics. Just a line at the end of the grain report about a missing boy. 12 years old? Last seen helping his grandfather haul debris near one of the back lots by the irrigation canal. No name. No pleading voice. Only facts, flat and cold. I turned the radio off. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The heat didn't break after sunset. The walls of the trailer held it in, trapping everything in a sticky haze that made my arms feel heavy. I sat out on the steps for a while, swatting at gnats, trying to ignore the way the corn hissed in short bursts. There was no wind. No bugs in the field. But something shifted out there every few minutes, just enough to make the dry leaves part. Always just out of sight. I stayed out until the light above the shed flickered twice, then dimmed. In the morning, he was there. The boy. I found him at the edge of the field, near the broken fence post. He wasn't lying in the dirt. He'd been lifted, nailed or tied or hung up somehow. Arms bent backwards at the elbows, then lashed outward in a wide cross, his back against the stalks like he'd been forced into place. Dry husks had been woven through his joints, tight bands of corn wrapped around his wrists and ankles. His face was still. Eyes closed. Lips sewn shut with what looked like fishing line. His skin had gone pale under the sun, but there was something bulging under his shirt. I didn't want to look. But I had to. I stepped closer, moved carefully through the dry plants, and reached for his collar. The cloth stuck to my fingers. When I pulled it back, kernels spilled out. Dry black corn. Packed tight into his stomach cavity. I don't know how many. Hundreds. They poured out slow at first, then in a rush. The smell hit me right after, the rot of damp husk and spoiled meat. I staggered back, nearly fell. Called it in, because that's the way it had to be. When the sheriff's deputy showed up, he didn't get close. Just stood there, 2 steps from the truck, arms folded. Another man, older, maybe with the coroner's office, knelt in the dirt, wrote something down, then asked if I'd moved the body. I shook my head. He nodded, like that was what he expected. They called it an accident. A farm injury. Said he must have gotten tangled in the fence somehow. There was no fence within 20 feet. One woman, maybe in her 70s, stood just outside the field. She didn't approach. Just muttered something under her breath, over and over. The only words I caught were, "Feeding the field." The next few hours were a blur. Statements. Questions. No real answers. The body was taken away. I was left with instructions not to interfere with the scene. As if that would help. That night, I kept the lights off again. Sat in the same place near the window. The corn whispered louder now. Not a rustle, not a breeze. Just soft movement, constant and aimless, like something brushing past the stalks, over and over, waiting. Sleep never came. And then, maybe around 2 in the morning, I heard the creak. Not the screen door this time. Something inside. A soft shift of weight across the trailer's floor. 1 foot, then another. Slow. Careful. I sat up, heart in my throat, and waited without moving. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't call out. Didn't reach for anything. Just breathed through my nose and listened. Whatever it was, it didn't speak. It didn't breathe loud. But I could hear the shift of dry silk against wood, like hands dragging threadbare cloth across the floor. I counted the steps. 5. Then nothing. Silence. The next morning, the front door was unlocked. I hadn't left it that way. I checked the desk again. The carving was still there. But something new had been added, right below the rhyme. A spiral, etched deep into the plastic. Not with a knife. It looked like it had been burned in. The edges were blackened, the grooves clean. That same spiral showed up again 3 hours later. I found it near the pump station along the east fence line, pressed into the soil like something heavy had been turning in place. No prints. No drag marks. Just that shape, tight and perfect, almost mechanical. The pump was still working. Nothing was broken. But I couldn't stop looking at it. That was when I decided to check the scarecrow again. I took the long way around, through the equipment shed and past the unused seed bins. The stalks near the scarecrow looked taller than the rest. Healthier. Almost green, even with the heat. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw the second change. Its arms weren't stretched wide anymore. One was still raised, but the other hung low, elbow bent like a half-wave. The twine bundle on its wrist had come undone. Black silk threads fluttered in the breeze. And its face, what I had thought was just wrinkled burlap, looked different now. The stitches weren't random. They formed something that resembled a mouth. A wide, toothless grin, puckered and sunken. I didn't sleep that night either. Just after midnight, I heard another sound, slow, scraping, steady. I stood at the back window and waited. The corn shifted again, a little closer now. Then a figure stepped into view. Human shape. Wrong movements. It didn't walk, it slid, like the stalks made space for it, and closed behind. I didn't look away. The figure passed through the moonlight for only a second. Just long enough for me to see the arms bent backwards, elbows out, hands trailing silk. It stopped. Not all the way. Just long enough to notice me. And then it turned back into the corn. I didn't breathe for a long time after that. The morning after the storm settled over the county like a thin, uneasy veil. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray that made everything look drained of color. Corn stalks sagged beneath the weight of ice crystals, and the fields stretched on, quiet and empty, but somehow still holding their breath. The cold bit into my face as I stepped outside, the gravel crunching underfoot brittle and sharp with frost. My breath came out in thin white clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. The wind was mostly gone, but the stillness felt deliberate, heavy, like the landscape itself was waiting. The scarecrow stood in the field, just beyond the ditch, looking more like a sentinel than a forgotten relic. Its form was rigid in the cold, the burlap face streaked with dark moisture where the frost had melted and refrozen. The wire mouth caught the weak morning light and glimmered faintly, a crude grin that seemed more mocking than harmless. One arm hung limply now, the black twine unraveling, threads snapping softly in the quiet air. Even from this distance, I could tell that something about it had shifted since the night before, subtle, but unsettling. I didn't want to approach, but I had to keep moving. The job wasn't finished. I checked the well gauges along the southern edge, fingers numb as I read the dials. Everything looked normal on the surface, but I kept glancing toward the scarecrow, a cold knot tightening in my chest every time I did. The fence was the next thing I examined. It ran low and weathered, posts set unevenly along the cornfield's border. Some of the older rails sagged under winter's weight, but a few posts had fresh damage. One leaned sharply at an unnatural angle, the wood splintered where something heavy had pressed against it. The ground around the base was churned up, muddy and torn like something had clawed at it, but no footprints marked the earth. The cold had frozen the soil solid, erasing any subtle tracks, but the scarring remained. I ran my gloved hand over the broken wood, feeling the splinters and jagged edges. My fingers trembled slightly. Something had been here overnight, something heavy and deliberate. I made notes in my log, careful to stay focused, but my eyes kept darting back toward the fields. There was movement in the distance. Not animals, too deliberate. The stalks shifted like a slow wave, bending and breaking as something passed through. I paused, breath caught. A dark shape flickered past, barely visible against the snow-tinged corn. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. Back at the trailer, I turned on the radio again. Static filled the small room, but soon a voice cut through, gruff, clipped, urgent. This is dispatch. We have a situation developing near the irrigation canal. Reports of multiple disappearances. All units proceed with caution. I grabbed my coat without hesitation, the cold air biting through the thin fabric as I stepped outside again. The quiet stretched like a taut wire, every sound amplified, the distant caw of a crow, the crunch of my boots, the faint whistle of wind threading through broken fence posts. The path to the canal was slick with ice and mud, forcing me to step carefully. I reached the bank where the water ran sluggish and dark beneath a thin sheet of ice. Equipment lay overturned, twisted metal catching what little light the overcast sky offered. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just eerie stillness. A chill ran down my spine. I called out, my voice sounding small and desperate in the open field. No reply. Then, near the edge of the cornfield, I spotted faint tracks in the soft mud. Bare footprints, strangely shaped and uneven, leading deeper into the shadows where the stalks thickened. I followed cautiously, the cold seeping into my bones, muscles tense and ready. The air smelled stale and damp, with an undercurrent of something sour, decay or rot, faint but unmistakable. The stalks closed behind me like walls. My footsteps sounded muffled against the thick layer of dead leaves and ice. The deeper I moved, the darker it became, the sky blocked by dense corn and frozen stalks. Then I heard it, the dry scrape of something dragging, slow and steady. I froze, every nerve alert. The sound wasn't consistent. Sometimes it paused, then started again, like whatever it was hesitated or shifted weight. A figure emerged suddenly, twisted and jerking in its movements, limbs bent at unnatural angles. It didn't step forward, but rather glided, or slid, through the stalks, the sound of dry silk or thread brushing against brittle leaves accompanying each movement. Its face was obscured, hidden in shadow, but two pale eyes caught the faint light and locked on me with a terrible focus. The mouth opened, revealing nothing but darkness inside, and I felt the air grow colder still. Time slowed. The figure's arms bent backwards at the elbows, the hands trailing tattered strips of cloth or silk, and it paused just long enough for me to see its skin, stretched tight over bone, pale and mottled, almost translucent. Then it vanished, slipping back into the corn with a whisper of movement. My breath came out ragged, my heart pounding like a drum in the silence that followed. I stumbled backward, the world around me suddenly sharp and hostile. The sky seemed to press down, the cold intensifying. I didn't look back until I reached the edge of the field and the safety of the broken fence. The rest of the day passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread. I kept the radio on, hoping for any word of the missing people or signs of help, but the airwaves were filled mostly with static and occasional garbled messages I couldn't make out. When night fell, the trailer felt smaller, the walls pressing inward. I double-checked the locks and windows, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched grew heavier. Around midnight, a faint tapping sound at the back door startled me. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't heavy footsteps, but something lighter, soft scratches, like nails or claws scraping against wood. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The sound stopped. But then I heard it, a low, wet dragging noise moving slowly around the perimeter of the trailer. It scraped and slid against the ground, uneven and unsteady. My pulse surged. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. In the dim moonlight, the corn stalks swayed gently, but one figure stood still, twisted and pale, limbs bent in the same unnatural way I'd seen earlier. Its head tilted toward the trailer, as if listening. It didn't move closer. Just stared. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat awake the rest of the night, listening for any sound, any sign that it had returned. When dawn came, I found new marks in the snow around the trailer, thin scratches in tight spirals, pressed into the frozen ground like someone had been pacing, waiting. I didn't recognize the pattern. It was mechanical, unnatural, almost like some kind of ritual. The scarecrow's position had changed again. One arm raised higher, the other lowered. The twine on its wrist was completely unraveled, and dark stains marked the fabric where the corn silk had touched the burlap. I knew then that the thing wasn't just passing through the field anymore. It was marking territory. Claiming. Watching. And I wasn't sure how much longer I had before it came for me. By the third night, the air had changed. Not the temperature, though it stayed hot well past midnight, but the weight of it. The wind didn't move. The bugs didn't stir. Even the corn had stopped its whispering. It felt like the land was holding its breath. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the trailer tick and groan with heat, waiting for something to brush against the screen or creak across the floorboards again. Nothing came. But just before sunrise I saw movement at the edge of the field. Not a figure this time. Just the scarecrow. It had shifted again. Both arms were down now. Bent wrong at the elbows, like they'd been broken and reset. Its head hung slightly to one side. And between the stalks around it, the soil looked darker than it should have, wet in places where there'd been no rain. I dressed fast and stepped outside with the toolkit in hand, but I didn't approach. Not yet. I needed to work first. I needed a reason to stay out there. The western pivots had stalled again. One of the gauges near the canal was reading low, so I made a wide circle around the scarecrow, keeping it behind me as long as I could. The ground felt softer beneath my boots, like something had been soaking into it all night. Not enough to make mud, just enough to leave prints. Deep ones. They were spaced wide, too far for any normal step. And they weren't boot tracks. No heel, no tread. Just long, wide impressions with a drag between them. Something heavy had passed through, and recently. When I reached the canal, I found the pipe housing half buried. Not from erosion. The soil had been moved, dug, then packed back in, like someone had tried to pull something from the earth and gave up halfway. There were handprints in the dirt. Deep ones. The kind you leave when you're kneeling with your weight behind it. I crouched to check the main valve, and that's when I saw it. Tucked behind the support bracket, almost hidden against the curve of the pipe, was a strip of flannel. Red and sun-faded, just like the shirt the scarecrow wore. The fabric had been torn, not cut. Threads dangled from the edge, stiff with something dark and dry. It hadn't been there before. I didn't touch it. I stood up, looked back across the field, and scanned the rows. The scarecrow was still there, slumped forward now. Like it had wilted. I walked back slower than I should have. Every few steps, I checked the corn to either side. Nothing moved. No wind. No birds. Even the irrigation creaked quieter than usual. When I got to the trailer, I found another bundle on the steps. This one was larger. Thicker. Wrapped tighter in more twine, and tucked inside was something new, 3 kernels of black corn, arranged in a triangle. They had a sheen to them, oily and wrong. I didn't throw this one away. I picked it up and sealed it inside a coffee tin, then set the tin in the cabinet under the sink and shut the door. That night I left every light on. Fan spinning in the window, radio turned low. I sat with the paperwork open in front of me and forced myself to write. Field notes. Gauge logs. Anything that made it feel like a regular job. Just past 11, the light over the sink flickered and went out. A moment later, the fan slowed, blades whining as they struggled against the heat. Then the bathroom light dimmed to a yellow haze, and the trailer went quiet, too quiet. I stepped to the front window and watched. Nothing moved. Then I saw the corn shift. A wide patch of it, just beyond the shed, began to bend, not swaying like in wind, but flattening in sections, slow and steady, like something massive was crawling underneath. The stalks parted in rows, but only for seconds. As soon as the shape passed, they snapped back up, as if they'd never moved at all. I backed away from the glass. Every part of me wanted to reach for the door, to run for the truck. But the keys weren't in it. I'd left them on the table by the fan. And even if I made it outside, there was no clear path. Just dry corn and heat and whatever was in it. I moved to the table and picked up the keys quietly, careful not to let them clink against the metal tray. Before I could step away, the radio buzzed once, an odd scratch of static, like interference from a storm that wasn't there. It wasn't static. It sounded more like someone brushing their hands slowly over the microphone. I froze. My fingers hovered over the dial, but I didn't touch it. For a long moment, the trailer was completely silent. Then a voice came through. Small. Shaky. Help. No name. No location. Just that one word, half-whispered, like whoever said it was afraid someone else might be listening. I reached for the volume and turned it all the way down. I stood still after that. At some point, I moved to the back of the trailer and waited near the window, watching for movement in the corn. It stayed still for a while. Then, sometime past midnight, the rows shifted again, this time much closer, not more than 30 yards from the back door. The equipment shed blocked most of the view, but I could tell whatever was moving was making its way in a slow arc around the trailer, sticking to the shadows where the moonlight didn't reach. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not fast. Not heavy. Just the soft, steady pressure of something moving across dry grass with purpose. One step. Then another. Then a pause. It wasn't trying to hide. I didn't breathe. The footsteps reached the far side of the trailer, and curved back around again. I moved toward the front, half expecting to hear the screen door swing open, or the fan fall off the sill, but nothing touched the door. Instead, there came a tapping sound on the window beside the desk. Not loud. Not frantic. Just the dry click of fingernail against glass. Once. Then again. 2 more times. The taps were spaced evenly, for a total. Then everything went still. I stayed up the rest of the night with the lights dimmed and the blinds drawn. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside and walked the length of the trailer. The ground was disturbed near the corners, wide, sunken prints in the dirt, and the same twisting spiral I'd seen burned into the desk now pressed into the soil like a stamp. The scarecrow stood where it had been, but even that had changed. Its arms were gone entirely, sleeves dangling empty at its sides. The chest of the shirt had been split down the middle and stitched back up with barbed wire. Dried silk and shredded stalks poked out between the metal knots. Hanging from its neck, strung with clear fishing line, was a necklace made from chicken bones. They'd been scrubbed clean. I turned away and drove east, toward the edge of the co-op's territory. A backup pump station sat there, barely used in the last 5 years, and I remembered seeing something odd on the maintenance map, an old inspection note about subsidence. When I reached the station, I spotted it almost immediately. A hole. Roughly 3 feet across, ringed with crooked slats of weathered fence posts. It hadn't been there a week ago. The soil around it had been churned up by hand, not with machinery. Whoever dug it had reinforced the walls to keep the dirt from collapsing, and it went deep, far deeper than it had any reason to. Propped beside the hole like a marker was a broken length of timber. Splinters at one end, and near the top, a rusted nail still held a strip of red flannel. Same color as the scarecrow's shirt. Same stiffness. Same dark stains clinging to the fabric edge. A bitter smell came up from the hole, wet wood and old blood. Something had been buried, or maybe pulled out. I didn't look down. I didn't step closer. I just backed away slowly, marked the location on the clipboard, and returned to the trailer. I logged the find like it was any other structural hazard. No mention of the bones. No mention of the shirt. Definitely nothing about what I'd heard on the radio. I didn't know how to explain any of it, and I doubted anyone would believe me even if I tried. That night, I kept the fan off. Left the lights off too. I sat near the wall with my ear to the floor, listening. Just after 1 in the morning, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slower than before, but more certain. This time they didn't circle the trailer. They approached the back door directly, each step dragging slightly through the dust. Then the doorknob turned. First a gentle click, then another. No rattling. No force behind it. Just the measured pressure of someone testing the lock, over and over. The deadbolt held firm, but the handle didn't stop moving. I stayed crouched in the dark, one hand against the floor, and listened. Something was breathing just on the other side of the door. Not fast, not ragged. Calm. Slow. Like it had all the time in the world. Then it spoke. I had barely caught on before the doorknob rattled, the thin metal twisting as if something tried to force its way in. The trailer shuddered under the weight of a presence that wasn't human. The air inside thickened, foul with damp earth and decay, suffocating and cold against my skin. I stayed pressed low in the corner, heart hammering like a drum, every muscle screaming to bolt but unable to move. A shadow stretched across the floor. The wall creaked as heavy limbs pressed against it, something massive and grotesque, claws scraping wood with a slow grinding sound that scraped my nerves raw. The creature was patient, calculating, each breath a wet rasp like soil dragged across stone. A violent crash tore through the thin walls as the door splintered inward. Wood exploded in shards, a burst of rotten earth and dry corn dust filling the air. I threw myself backward, smashing into the table. My hands scraped against the rough surface as the creature's elongated fingers reached inside, pulling at the torn frame. The stench hit me then, a choking wave of rot, wet decay, and something foul beneath it all, like a grave freshly disturbed. My lungs screamed for air. The blood in my ears pulsed with adrenaline. I shoved the broken door frame with all my might, but it barely slowed the thing. It pushed in, dragging itself through the opening, limbs bent at unnatural angles, skin stretched tight and pale like dried husk. Its face, a grotesque mockery of mine, twisted into that stitched grin, lips torn and splayed in a silent scream. I scrambled away, tripping over a chair leg, slamming into the wall as it advanced. Every step it took crushed the scattered debris beneath it. The ground seemed to recoil beneath its weight. I grabbed the only weapon I had, the old hunting knife from my belt, and lunged, slashing at its arm. The blade bit deep, slicing through skin that felt tougher than leather. Dark, sticky fluid oozed out, smelling like damp earth and rusted iron. The creature hissed, an unnatural, gurgling sound, and swung its arm back. I barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as the clawed fingers scraped along the wall beside me. Blood dripped down my forearm from the cut, mixing with sweat and dirt. Pain flared, but I couldn't stop. I jabbed the knife again, desperate. It tore into the creature's chest, a wet ripping sound, and for a moment it staggered, a guttural scream bursting from that twisted mouth. But it recovered faster than I could breathe. The creature lunged, knocking me to the floor with a heavy weight. I hit hard, breath leaving me in a harsh rasp as its hands pinned my arms, fingers digging into muscle and bone. Its cold breath brushed my cheek, foul and rotten, as it leaned close. "You fed me," it rasped, voice low and terrible, a twisted echo of my own. Panic surged, freezing my mind for just a second, then fury exploded. I twisted, slashing blindly with the knife. The blade sank deep into the side of its neck. It howled, a sound like stone grinding, and released me. I scrambled back, gasping, blood running down my hands, the smell sharp and metallic. The creature didn't stop. It charged again, faster this time, limbs snapping forward like broken branches. I dodged, tripping over the wrecked furniture, heart pounding against ribs like a hammer. Outside, the field roared to life, the corn stalks bending and thrashing as if alive, snapping like brittle bones under an invisible force. The earth shook beneath the trailer, cracks spiderwebbing through the dirt as the creature dragged itself toward the open doorway. I staggered to my feet and ran. The cold night air hit my face as I burst outside. The creature followed, grotesque and relentless, limbs bending wrong, its mouth stretched wide in that silent grin. It reached out, nails digging into my jacket, tearing flesh with sharp, scraping rips. I yanked free, stumbling backward toward the pale glow seeping from the cracked earth between the rows of corn. The ground pulsed, rising and falling like lungs buried beneath the soil. The creature snarled, chasing me through the rows. Leaves slapped my face and arms, slicing thin, bleeding cuts. My breath came ragged, lungs burning with cold and exhaustion. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small tin, the black kernels inside pulsing faintly with an eerie light. The creature was almost on me. I flung the tin into the glowing spiral splitting the earth. The ground roared and shifted violently. The soil cracked open wider, sharp teeth lining the spiraled maw. A terrible, wet stench filled the air as something massive stirred beneath the surface. The creature screamed, a high-pitched, rasping sound filled with rage and hunger, and lunged toward the opening. I ran for the nearest tree line, feeling roots and dirt tear at my boots. Behind me, the field convulsed, the spiral closing slowly but relentlessly. I didn't look back. Branches tore at my skin as I crashed through the underbrush, the creature's cries echoing in my ears like the last death throes of something monstrous. When I finally burst into the cold, clear dawn light beyond the tree line, the nightmare stayed buried beneath the earth, swallowed by silence and soil. But I knew it was still there, waiting. The forest held its breath as I staggered away from the edge of the field, sweat and blood mixing on my skin beneath the early morning haze. My chest rose and fell unevenly, lungs aching with cold air that tasted sharp and raw, filling the silence with every ragged breath. The underbrush cracked beneath my boots as I forced one foot in front of the other, moving without purpose except away. Behind me, the field lay still, the scar in the earth sealed tight as if nothing had disturbed it. The corn stalks stood stiff and silent, their leaves motionless in the pale light. No whisper of movement stirred the rows, no echo of the creature's scream remained, only the faintest scent of damp soil and something older, buried beneath. I kept walking, each step slower than the last, the ache in my legs spreading like cold fire. My hands shook, fingers slick with dried blood and grime, and my vision blurred at the edges. Every shadow seemed to cling tighter, every breeze carried whispers I couldn't place. The world felt hollow, stretched thin between the nightmare and waking. When I reached the narrow dirt road I paused. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, loose stones skittering forward as if urging me onward. I looked back once, toward the dark edge of the field, but the forest swallowed the sight. I didn't say a word. There was no one to tell, no one who could understand. The radio had been silent since that night, the bass too distant to hear my calls, and even if they did, what words could explain this? Days passed. I camped at the edge of the forest, my thoughts restless and tangled. Nights were worse, empty except for the weight of quiet, the ache of memories pressing in with each breath. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the field's breath returned, slow and steady beneath my skin, the stitched smile leering from shadowed corners. I tried to write it all down, to make sense of what happened, but the words felt heavy, brittle. The black kernels, the spiral in the earth, the creature wearing my face, it all folded into itself like a dark knot I couldn't unravel. Sometimes, in the distance, I swear I hear the rustle of leaves where none should be. The faint crackle of stalks bending just beyond sight. And once, I thought I caught a glimpse of that twisted smile watching from the tree line, half hidden in shadow. I know now some things don't stay buried, no matter how deep the earth swallows them. They wait, patient and hungry, growing in the silence between the seasons. I packed my gear slowly and left before dawn, driving east, past the canal, past the empty fields that smelled faintly of rot and rain. I didn't look back, but the weight of the land stayed with me, the slow pulse beneath the soil, the cold fingers trailing just out of reach. Some nights, when the wind rises and the world falls quiet, I swear the ground is breathing still. And I know, without doubt, that I fed it something. It is waiting.